Welcome back to the deep dive. This is the place where we don't just skim the surface. We take a massive stack of sources, articles, clinical research, you name it, and we distill it all down into the essential truths you need.
And today we're undertaking what I think is a deeply personal and honestly a profoundly illuminating mission.
Yeah, it really is. We're doing a deep dive into the long-term sort of psychological footprint that gets left behind when you grow up with parents who just couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, meet your basic emotional needs.
We're pulling really heavily today from the foundational work of psychologist Lindsay C. Gibson, specifically her work on what she calls emotionally immature parents, or EIPs for short.
Right.
And her insights are just, there's such a powerful roadmap for understanding how these childhood experiences can ripple out and affect your adult life, your relationships, and maybe most crucially, your fundamental sense of self-worth.
And I want to be really clear. The sources we're using today, they aren't just academic. This is a powerful opportunity for self-understanding and, really, for healing. If you're here, you're probably looking for knowledge that's quick to grasp but also deeply thorough.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission today is to extract those essential nuggets for self-awareness. And we're going to be focusing heavily on this foundational and frankly devastating concept of emotional loneliness.
And I think it's important to frame this correctly from the start.
Please.
This deep dive isn't about casting blame backward. It's about recognizing patterns, understanding your own past, and giving you the power to shape your future because you finally understand yourself on a much deeper level.
Exactly. It's about understanding, not blaming.
Yeah, and that's essential context. The core concept we're really exploring here is emotional neglect. It's the failure to notice or to attend to or to validate a child's inner life.
And it's as real as any other kind of neglect.
Dr. Gibson frames it as a phenomenon that's just as real and damaging as any physical deprivation. When a child is physically neglected, the signs are obvious to everyone. But when a child is emotionally neglected, the damage is invisible, and yet it's so pervasive.
So how does this even happen? I mean, we're not talking about outright malice here, are we? We're talking about immaturity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the key. The central question is, what happens? What are the long-term consequences when a child, often a child who's naturally sensitive and perceptive, actually becomes more emotionally mature than their own parents?
That's a huge thing to wrap your head around.
It is. And when those immature parents lack the self-awareness and the emotional responsiveness they need to genuinely meet their child's complex emotional needs, well, that child learns very early on that their deepest feelings are an inconvenience, or worse, a risk.
And what we see in the literature is this really stark pattern that defines these emotionally immature parents, these EIPs. They seem to be unified by a deep, almost instinctual fear of genuine emotion.
Oh, absolutely. They reject self-reflection because it's just too threatening for them. They avoid vulnerability at all costs. I mean, they're the classic individuals who can never truly apologize or accept blame.
Why is that?
Because confronting their own shortcomings forces them to engage with reality, and for them, that's just too painful. So this emotional unreliability that becomes the key feature that the child has to learn to navigate.
And because they're relying on these, I don't know, these rigid, almost primitive coping mechanisms that resist reality, things like denial, distortion, blame.
Instead of actually dealing with it.
Right. Instead of dealing with it, they're profoundly inconsistent. And I think this is the painful truth. When their own emotional equilibrium or their own survival instincts come into play, their child's emotional needs will almost always lose out.
And that truth is difficult. But recognizing it for what it is, which is a limit on the parent's capacity, not a reflection of the child's worth, that is the very first step towards psychological freedom.
Okay, let's unpack this a little more. This fear of genuine emotion and what it actually means for a child's development. We need a really concrete working definition of these emotionally immature parents.
Well, they're defined by the fact that they actively pull back from emotional closeness. They're resistant to dealing with reality as it is.
Right.
They prefer distortion or denial as coping tools.
Which means the child never gets a reliable compass, right? For emotional navigation.
They never do.
Yeah.
And this emotional distance, it directly undermines the development of emotional intimacy. And when that's missing, that becomes the root of the adult child's suffering.
Let's talk about that. Emotional intimacy is more than just talking, I assume.
Oh, it's so much more. It's the basis for all psychological security.
Okay, so can you tell us more about that baseline of security? What do the sources define it as? What does it feel like?
It's knowing deep down in your bones that you have someone you can tell absolutely anything to, someone you can go to with all your feelings, the
Yeah.
messiness, the uncertainty, the overwhelming joy,
All the
all of it, and feel completely safe opening up. It's a sense of being truly seen and accepted for who you are, vulnerabilities and all, without feeling judged or like you need to be fixed or just dismissed. That right there is the non-negotiable emotional baseline for a secure attachment.
And to really grasp the deficit, I think we need to contrast EIPs with emotionally immature parents, what we might call, the psychological gold standard. How do these mature parents behave differently?
Yeah, the contrast is really powerful. Emotionally mature parents have successfully developed self-awareness, so they're comfortable with their own internal landscape, their own disappointments and their own flaws.
And that comfort with themselves naturally extends to being comfortable with their kids' feelings.
Exactly. They're emotionally attuned to their children's moods. They can kind of read the room, so to speak. And they're consistent, they're dependable. And crucially, they welcome their children's feelings with genuine interest.
That distinction, welcoming feelings with interest, that feels like where the real magic happens, doesn't it? Because an EIP might tolerate a child's feeling, but they won't welcome it.
Precisely. Whether the child is seeking comfort after, say, painful social rejection, or they're sharing this boundless enthusiasm for some new small discovery, the mature parent meets that moment with engaged attention.
They validate the emotion.
They validate it, which makes the child feel safe connecting. They have a lively, balanced emotional life themselves, and they're consistent in their attentiveness, which makes them emotionally dependable, like a stable center in the child's world.
So the inverse of that, the result of EIP parenting, is the defining pain we're here to explore today, emotional loneliness.
Hmm.
When EIPs are self-preoccupied, which, let's be honest, they almost always are, they completely miss the child's emotional cues. They don't notice the child's inner experience. They discount feelings.
And that deep-seated fear of emotional intimacy causes them to just abruptly shut down or push the child away. And we have to be clear, this neglect isn't neutral. It's an active process.
How so?
Well, if a child becomes upset or scared or even overly enthusiastic, the EIP often gets nervous. That emotion threatens their own fragile emotional equilibrium
And they might respond with anger or frustration.
or even punishment instead of offering comfort.
Which means those reactions, whether they're dismissive or actively punitive, they immediately shut down the child's instinctive biological urge to reach out. They're effectively closing the door to emotional contact and leaving the child standing all alone on the outside.
And this creates a core emptiness. The sources note that for the child, this painful emotional loneliness, it doesn't register as a temporary state or a problem they can solve.
It just becomes a fact of
It's
existence.
normal.
Yeah.
That's the tragedy of it. They have no internal frame of reference to understand that most people don't spend their lives feeling fundamentally separate from the people who are supposed to be closest to them.
That lack of recognition is exactly why the loneliness is so devastating. I mean, the child might have all their physical needs met. They were fed, housed, kept safe from physical harm. But if their internal world of feelings is constantly discounted or punished, that loneliness becomes the primary emotional landscape of their entire childhood. They learn to ignore their own emotional radar.
To really grasp the weight of emotional loneliness, I think we need to understand the visceral, lived sensation of it. This moves beyond just a clinical definition to the client stories that really illustrate that feeling of being utterly isolated, even when you're technically surrounded by family and activity.
Let's turn to David's story from the research. He grew up in what looked like a successful, busy household, but he described his family life as living parallel lives with no points of contact. He felt utterly isolated.
And he articulated this loneliness not just as sadness, but as a heavy, permanent sensation of emptiness and nothingness.
The fact that he accepted this as normal, a fact of my existence, it just shows how deeply ingrained that feeling was. It was his default mode.
It was. And Rhonda's story further highlights this feeling of having to cope all by yourself. She recalls being 7, standing by a moving truck with her parents and 3 older siblings. Physically, she was there with everyone.
But emotionally, she was completely abandoned.
Utterly abandoned.
Yeah.
She felt totally alone, unable to ask questions about the
Oh.
move, like where are we going, what's school going to be like. And she was exhausted by the sense that she had to cope with this enormous life change entirely by herself. The fear was hers to manage, not something to share.
And you realize that the internalizer, the highly sensitive child she likely was, has to expend this enormous amount of energy just managing their internal fear and grief, all while trying to present a calm, I got this exterior.
just to avoid triggering the parent's own discomfort.
Right. And that energy drain is just
It
immense.
sets the stage for a lifetime of exhaustion, yes. They
Yeah.
learn that being emotionally present just requires too much internal cost.
Okay, here's where it gets really, really interesting because this core emptiness, it doesn't just magically vanish when the child turns 18. Emotional loneliness carries right into adulthood and it manifests in these repeating, self-defeating patterns.
Hmm.
The adult child often unwittingly chooses emotionally unavailable partners or just struggles intensely to find the deep reciprocal connection they crave. They seek a familiarity, even if that familiarity is a painful one.
The patterns are cyclical because that deep isolation they felt as a child becomes the only template for adult intimacy they truly recognize. They're drawn to that low reciprocity dynamic, especially if they're high-functioning people who struggle to take their own pain seriously.
Sophie's story from the case files illustrates this dynamic perfectly, and we really need to unpack this one. She was 32, a nurse, successful, dating a guy named Jerry for 5 years, and she was hoping for marriage.
Right, so they go back to the restaurant to their first date. Jerry gives her a jewelry box, and Sophie's heart just stops. She thinks, this is it. This is the moment I finally get the deep connection I've been waiting for.
But when she opens the box, there's no ring, just a square of paper with a childishly drawn question mark on it. And Jerry grins and says, "Now you can tell your friends I finally popped the question."
He saw this as a hilarious way to avoid seriousness and commitment. Just a joke.
Sophie's immediate reaction was shock, then fury, and then this deep, profound hurt. But the real psychological insight came when she called her mother, looking for comfort and validation.
And instead of siding with her, her mother actually dismissed the whole thing, called it a funny joke, and told Sophie she was overreacting and shouldn't be mad. The mother was siding with the avoidance, with the denial.
And that was the painful realization. In that moment of seeking refuge, Sophie realized her mother and Jerry shared the exact same profound emotional insensitivity, that inability to grasp the emotional weight of an action.
She hadn't left the relationship pattern behind at all.
Not at all. She had simply re-entered her childhood emotional loneliness, feeling invalidated every single time she tried to articulate her genuine hurt. The denial system she grew up with was being replicated by her chosen partner and then affirmed by her own mother.
And this cycle is perpetuated by the insidious nature of denial. As the sources point out, denial forces us to repeat the same painful situation over and over because unconsciously, we never truly see the pattern coming the next time.
Sophie had recreated the emotional distance she grew up with, believing that if she just tried harder, the lack of intimacy would somehow resolve itself.
Which brings us to the overwhelming guilt that high-functioning adult children of EIPs feel. They look competent, they can list all the objective positives in their lives. I have a good job, a home, I should be happy.
And yet they feel miserable, fundamentally alone, lacking that deep intimacy.
They're suffering from that classic physical needs met, emotional needs neglected dilemma.
And this is where the confusion comes from, right? They feel guilty for wanting something more profound. They come to therapy saying things like, relationships are always going to have frustrations. It's work, right? I just need to tolerate it.
And we have to make a core distinction here. Good relationships do take effort for things like communication, compromise, forbearance.
Sure.
But it absolutely should not take work just to be noticed or to establish a basic emotional connection. That should be the easy, natural, and pleasurable part.
If you are constantly performing emotional labor just to get the other person to look up from their own internal world, you are reenacting that childhood dynamic. You're working for a basic connection that should be freely given.
Exactly. When they believe relationships must be inherently hard work, it reflects that lifelong pattern. These adult children were trained by EIPs to discount their own feelings and instincts, which leads them to acquiesce to relationships they don't truly want or relationships that are just fundamentally exhausting.
They believe it's their job to make the unrewarding connection work, and they rationalize the sheer effort required.
And the level of shame they feel about having needs is just immense. It warps their natural desire for love and comfort into this deep fear of appearing needy or weak.
We see this so powerfully in Jake's story. He married Kayla, a bubbly woman who genuinely loved him, but he was profoundly unhappy, forcing himself to be upbeat and just exhausted by trying to be the person she wants me to be.
Jake was performing a role self for his wife, terrified of revealing his genuine strain. When he was asked what would happen if he just honestly told Kayla about his stress and his need for support, Jake immediately became highly anxious.
And what does he say?
He said she would be devastated and furious. And this was the reaction he'd internalized from his angry mother, who would blow up if people didn't perform happiness and success on demand.
He looked physically embarrassed when he was discussing his emotional needs, almost whispering, "When you say it like that, I sound pitiful and needy." He was convinced that showing emotional vulnerability meant he was weak, flawed, and a burden, a message that was drilled into him since childhood. He learned that survival meant concealing need.
That internalization is so damaging because it signals that the parent's need for emotional control and for avoiding their own discomfort was constantly overriding and extinguishing the child's natural emotional life force. And this fear of neediness isn't limited by gender either.
No, we see the same pattern in Megan's story. She married a wealthy real estate broker at her parents' urging after she became pregnant. Years later, she wanted to leave, but she felt trapped, unable to express the depth of her dissatisfaction.
Her husband and her parents consistently discounted her complaints, that she wasn't being listened to, that her feelings were disregarded, that they never had fun. They just labeled them as emotional complaints or irrelevant arguments.
So her family was focused on convincing her that she was mistaken about her own unhappiness, never once seeking to actually understand her experience. She felt this immense guilt because her subjective emotional needs were outweighing the objective reality of her material life and her marital vows.
And here is the core truth the source is present. Relationships are sustained by the pleasure of emotional intimacy, that feeling that someone is truly interested in your experience. Vows and material stability are not the fuel.
Emotional responsiveness is the essential ingredient.
It is. And Megan realized that without that responsiveness, the marriage was emotionally bankrupt. She ultimately came to this profound realization about her deepest desire. She shyly told the therapist, "I want to matter the most to someone. I want someone to want to be with me."
And then immediately she looked confused and asked, "Is that too much to ask? I really don't know."
And that moment is the tragedy of emotional neglect encapsulated. It trains the adult child to believe that a natural, healthy, basic human desire to feel special, seen, and loved is inherently selfish or too much to ask.
It's a direct consequence of her husband and parents constantly reinforcing the idea that her emotional needs were negotiable or just irrelevant.
The healing goal, then, is helping the adult child recognize that these internal prompts, that feeling that something is profoundly missing, are not flaws. They're trustworthy. You can trust yourself to know when you are emotionally satisfied. You're not a bottomless pit of demands. You simply need to feel that full measure of connection, which, as we'll discuss later, is a biological imperative, not a psychological weakness. Before we delve into the specific characteristics of emotionally immature parents, which can feel a bit overwhelming, I think it's critical to properly define the opposing concept, maturity. Because without a target, you don't really know what you're moving toward.
Right. So how does the literature define emotional maturity? It sounds like it's more than just being functional or having a job.
It's about integration. Emotional maturity means a person is capable of thinking objectively and conceptually about reality while at the same time maintaining deep emotional connections to others.
So they function independently while sustaining deep attachments.
Exactly. They pursue their goals directly without exploiting others, and they have a well-developed, cohesive, and reliable sense of self. They're comfortable with complexity.
And immaturity, then, is defined by what?
Immaturity is defined by an over-reliance on coping mechanisms that deny, distort, or replace reality with simpler fictions. It's an automatic, unconscious personality pattern, which is why EIPs rarely apologize or truly connect or experience regret.
There's no cringe factor.
There isn't, because they don't step back to consider their impact on others. They're too busy managing their own internal distress.
Let's jump into the key personality traits that define EIPs, starting with their rigidity and single-mindedness. This seems to be their primary defense mechanism against emotional complexity.
It is. EIPs cope by narrowing reality down to something black and white, simple and manageable. Once they form an opinion, their minds are closed, and they become intensely defensive and humorless when they're challenged.
In their world, there is only one right answer.
Exactly. And this inflexibility, while it sometimes allows them to function effectively in clear, structured paths, makes emotional relationships, which thrive on nuance, almost impossible.
And this feeds directly into their low-stress tolerance and intense reactivity. They seem to explode over minor things that a mature adult would just navigate.
They do. Regulating emotions is incredibly difficult for them, and when they get upset, they don't look for constructive solutions. They expect others to instantly soothe them by doing exactly what they want.
They avoid self-reflection at all costs.
At all costs. They prefer to minimize their mistakes and immediately blame others. Their responses are often reactive and stereotype, the same anger, the same pouting, the same withdrawal, because they lack the capacity to objectively assess a new situation.
That anxious self-focus leads directly to the next critical trait: egocentricity and self-involvement.
And this is often misread as just selfishness, but it's deeper than that. This self-involvement is obsessive. It's fueled by chronic anxiety and a profound insecurity. They're constantly monitoring whether their own needs are being met or whether anything has offended them. The world revolves around their internal barometer of comfort.
So their self-esteem is perpetually shaky, constantly rising or falling based on how other people react to them. They can't tolerate criticism because it threatens their core stability.
Precisely. And because their self-involvement is all-consuming, other people's feelings and needs are instantly eclipsed by their own. Think of the woman in the source material who, after being gently told that her incessant criticisms of the father were hurtful to the listener,
What was her response?
she responded by saying, "Well, if I couldn't tell you, I wouldn't have anybody to talk to."
Wow. That is a perfect, chilling encapsulation of egocentricity. The pain of the listener is instantly reframed and dismissed as a threat to the speaker's personal need for an audience.
It's not about the person receiving the criticism. It's only about the person needing to vent. And this is why they often become the center of attention in groups or families, dominating time and energy. Often not because they're charismatic, but because others just aren't willing to endure the fallout of trying to shift the focus away from them.
Impaired empathy is another central characteristic, and this is really where the damage is done.
It's critical because EIPs are often strikingly blind to how they make others feel. They lack the highest form of empathy, which is called mentalization, the ability to genuinely imagine that others have their own unique, complex minds and thought processes distinct from their own.
Okay, let's elaborate on mentalization because that's a key psychological concept for our listeners. If they can't imagine others have their own minds, how do they navigate the world at all?
They navigate by reading surface intentions, which is sometimes called being canny. They can sense tension, but they don't feel true compassion. They might be skilled at reading whether someone is upset at them, but this insight is often used defensively for control, not for intimacy.
So the adult child often describes feeling sized up but not felt for.
Exactly. There's recognition of their presence,
Yeah.
but no emotional resonance or depth.
So if I send a mature friend a quick text saying, "Ugh, what a rough day," they might think, my friend is struggling, I wonder if they need to vent or a distraction.
Right.
But an EIP, lacking mentalization, might immediately think, is this person upset at me? Are they going to try and ask me for something?
That is the perfect contrast. The mature person assumes an internal state and context for the other person. The EIP immediately turns the information inward, assessing threat or inconvenience to their peace. This inability to resonate with others stems from their fundamental lack of self-development. If they haven't developed self-awareness regarding their own complex emotions, they can't possibly resonate with their child's inner world.
And this incomplete development is also why they're often profoundly inconsistent.
They're an amalgam of various borrowed parts, different social roles, different personas that don't fit together cohesively. This leads to contradictory and often baffling behaviors. They step in and out of emotional states, totally unaware of their inconsistency, leaving the child constantly guessing and anxious, always trying to calculate which parental version they're facing today.
And this often results in a massive role reversal. Instead of parenting, they expect their children to soothe their feelings, manage their moods, and provide unconditional approval.
They indulge their own feelings like children, and the child is forced to step up and act as the adult. Frida's story provides a powerful analogy for this. Her father, Martin, was physically abusive at home, but a respected, upstanding citizen in public.
A total contradiction.
Total. He demanded his children exhibit total self-control while he indulged his own volatile, explosive moods. Frida was expected to not only absorb his anger, but then quickly revert to providing him with an almost maternal love and admiration when he was calm.
And the incident with the porch swing brings this to life so well.
When Frida moved out, Martin decided, without any consultation, that she needed a porch swing, a massive, custom-made one, bolted into her tiny deck, taking up all the space. It was impossible to move without tools.
Oh, wow.
And Frida realized it was the perfect analogy for how Martin took up all the space in her family. A demanding, unwanted gift that required her admiration, regardless of her actual needs or desires for her own life space. Recognizing his emotional immaturity later gave her the psychological permission and freedom to finally have that swing removed. She was removing the physical manifestation of his emotional demands on her space.
It's also crucial to note this confusing phenomenon where EIPs often focus heavily on the physical. This is why so many adult children are confused about their emotional neglect.
They may, in fact, excel at providing physical care. They were fed, they got medical attention, they had material goods, maybe even the best education. But they completely fail emotionally.
So the child receives this overwhelming physical evidence that their parents loved and sacrificed for them, which creates intense cognitive dissonance when it's paired with a painful lack of emotional security.
Right.
They can point to the broken arm that was fixed or the expensive college education. They confuse competence in physical caretaking with emotional nurturing.
Right.
The caretaking during an illness, for instance, felt safe for the parent because it was objective and sanctioned as restoring physical health. But emotional attachment, vulnerability, sharing deep feelings, all that felt threatening. And this disparity contributes significantly to the adult child's guilt about complaining. They feel like an ungrateful brat because they received physical sustenance, but they're craving emotional nourishment.